Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today is the 7th of July and today I'm going to be talking exclusively about the Bakhmut sector. And sorry for not uploading for the past 2 days. I was at Six Flags, but now I'm back and I'm going to be uploading very regularly. Let's get into what's occurred around the southern flank of Bakhmut, around Klishchiivka, because I find it very interesting and it opens up the possibility for battles raging again on the outskirts and perhaps within the city of Bakhmut yet again. And so let's go back to about July 3rd and talk about the Ukrainian attacks in the direction of Klishchiivka and, as of today, Russia's attempts at counterattacking. And so we all know that Russians at some point held positions on the western side of the Donbass Canal. That canal, if you don't know, is located over here generally. This is where it spans. And so the Russians had positions on the western side of this canal, looking at something like this. And so these were their forward positions in some trenches, tree lines, and quarries. And so the Ukrainians, really since March of this year, they've been trying to clear out the Russian forward positions. And over the past month, they've finalized their success in that direction, pushing out the Russians from their final forward positions and beginning to cross over the Donbass Canal, which is not necessarily difficult because the canal itself, if you zoom in, you see that it's really only about 56 feet in width and that the water levels are very low. So an infantryman could pretty easily cross over the canal. They could set up a very minor impromptu bridge, sappers, and just cross over it if they don't want to get their feet wet. And then also armored vehicles could cross over. There's already videos of Ukrainian tanks engaging with Russian tanks to the east of the canal, which indicates that those tanks had to cross over the canal at some point, which means that it is pretty easy for Ukraine to move heavy equipment across that canal, which means that the opportunity for an offensive towards Klishchiivka is now very, very possible. It's very easy for Ukraine to move large amounts of forces across the canal and attack from multiple different directions towards the town. And so what we saw is that the 3rd Assault Brigade of the Ukrainian Armed Forces and the IDAR Battalion, 2 units which I have marked over here, this one and this one. Well, that's a 5th Assault Regiment, sorry. The third one is over here, 3rd Separate Assault Brigade Azov, because it was formerly the Azov Battalion. And so those 2 units, they are really at the vanguard of this attack. And they are really split up into different smaller assault detachments, and those assault detachments are the ones crossing over the canal and taking over key positions adjacent to the canal in some bush lines. And that's how the Ukrainians established control on the eastern side for the first time. So they set up positions in these bush lines, and then they started expanding out, taking over control of key trench lines that were under Russian control in the open fields. So the most salient trench line that they took over around July 3rd was this trench system over here that I'm going to zoom in on. You can see it's a pretty small piece of land, but still it's like 0.3 miles wide, but this entire trench line is still incredibly important as it is a very good defensive position and it provides an area for the Ukrainian forces to sort of lodge themselves in for a temporary amount of time before they keep on going and push deeper into the Russian lines. And so they were able to take over this stronghold, and they took over other strongholds in this area as they began clearing out Russian fortifications and Russian dugouts within different forest plantations. And there's footage of this, of the Ukrainians clearing out these forests in really squad-sized formations. And they did take some Russian POWs, but really those were isolated incidents. And when POWs were taken, it was usually like 1 or 2 at a time. So this again indicates that the amount of forces, amount of men fighting at the front line is actually very low in terms of the ones that are going out with small arms, rifles, and shooting at each other and trying to take over different trenches. That number is actually very low in certain areas because a lot of these different formations are fighting with a very small amount of manpower, which makes them very mobile as well. And so what we saw going into July 5th, July 3rd to July 5th, is that the Ukrainians were making very significant gains in the fields that were between the canal and Klishchiivka. So that would be really this area to this area. The Ukrainians took over generally positions in those spots. Let's actually look at the distances for that. You can see they advanced perhaps about 1.3 miles in that direction towards the western outskirts of Klishchiivka. and they had already established positions within some of the forested patches on the western side of the town, which indicated they were about to infiltrate inside the town itself. So they had very good positions, and we're also going to talk about the topography of their positions. But before we get into that, the Ukrainians knew that they would not be able to take over full control of the town without assaulting from the north as well, because you need to have control of the northern flank in order to have full domination, full fire control over the town of Klishchiivka, and that's due to the topography. But basically what happened here is that the Ukrainians, they launched another assault from the north with their formations from Ivanivske and pushed the Russians all the way back to their one major trench system to the north of the town of Klishchiivka, which is located on a bit of a height. This stronghold over here. The Russians were forced to vacate it for a certain period of time, but the Ukrainians never got full control over this trench system. If you zoom in, you could see the markings of the trench from the satellite imagery, which just goes to show how expansive it really is. But they were never able to get full control over the northern flank, even on July 5th, which is when they were really on their maximum, their highest point of control around the outskirts of the town. And so let's look at the topography of this for a second. So here you can see that the Ukrainians, they concentrated a lot of their effort on the western side of Klishchiivka, to the west of it. And this is where you have very high elevation, perhaps about 750 feet above sea level on these heights that Ukraine controls versus the Russian positions on the valley in Klishchiivka. Klishchiivka is located on a valley, a very low elevation. And that's at about 500 feet. So there's a massive discrepancy. And this means that Ukrainian small arms fire, ATGMs, mortar crews, they have the high ground, and they can very easily fire upon Russian forces over there. They can fire upon the roads leading into Klishchiivka, because those are also located on low elevation. Over here you can see. And so getting control of the western heights is important, but also the northern heights. The northern heights are about in this area, in this red square. And that's also where you have that trench system that I was talking about before. So that's not a part of Klishchiivka, it's just to the north of it on a hill. But the Ukrainians never got control of that hill, they never got full control. The Russians were able to maintain control of it, which allowed them to solidify control over the northern flank and prevent a full collapse of the Russian line in Klishchiivka. But I do believe that even though the Russians were reinforcing their positions within the town of Klishchiivka, they did probably move out their forward command garrisons in field headquarters from Klishchiivka, because those were actually located in this town for months, because Klishchiivka is an important Russian city on the front line, which connects to different supply lines around Bakhmut. So they had to move their command garrisons out of here, out of this town, further to the east. And they also had to move out some of their heavy equipment, but they did maintain all of their infantrymen within the town to hold on to it, because a collapse of the Russian line at Klishchiivka would open the floodways and would allow Ukraine to advance deeper to the Russian southern flank around Bakhmut, cross over the rail line, and perhaps even reach key Russian towns like, Counterattack from the north, or perhaps reaching the highway connecting the Russian line around Donetsk into Bakhmut from this southern road by taking over Underdivka, for instance, taking over key local supply lines and key local logistical command hubs, coordination hubs like Zaitsev. So you see it opens up this floodgate, and it would also allow the Ukrainians to flank the Russian positions from the south and reach Bakhmut from the southern outskirts around a place like Opitny, Ivanhrad. And so it would be a reverse of what Russia was trying to do when they began their flanking operations around Bakhmut. And so that's why we have these reports from Ukrainian sources that the Russians were moving 2 new divisions in the direction of Klishchiivka. Now, I can't confirm this, and I don't even know whether, I don't even know the names of those divisions that were moved to this area of the fighting. So I can't confirm or deny that. But I do know that the Russians did, in recent weeks, move 2 new tank regiments to the south Bakhmut sector, not necessarily to Klishchiivka itself, but to the general area to the south of Bakhmut. And so you have here a new unit in this area, 68th Tank Regiment and the 80th Tank Regiment. And there are many other units in this area, specifically from VDV, DPR, LPR, soldiers, motorized infantry troops from the Russian regular army. But in terms of the tank regiments, we don't really know their size. It's hard to estimate. But from what I read about these tank regiments from this good article on Newsweek, Each tank regiment had around 93 tanks and 3 battalions before the SMO. And we don't know how many of those 93 tanks per regiment are still in operation. We don't know if those got destroyed during the fighting. And depending on the amount of tanks in each specific battalion of the tank regiment, that changes the number of troops that are within that unit. Because if you have, 30 different tanks, then you're going to have 3 men per tank, because you need 3 in each specific tank to make a crew. And then you also need additional men for maintenance and for repair. And so if many of those tanks got destroyed, then they would probably have to reduce the size of that unit. And so we don't know the specific amount of men in each one. We don't know how many tanks are left in each battalion. But I will say that from Ukrainian sources, and again, take whatever the Ukrainians say with a grain of salt, obviously, but what they said about one specific tank regiment, the 26th Tank Regiment, is that they only had 10 tanks left within each of their battalions. And so beforehand, based on the 93 number, it would have to be 31 tanks per battalion. But what this Ukrainian source was saying is that there was 10 left in each battalion, which would mean that you'd have, 30 operators per battalion for each of those tanks, those T-80 tanks in the case of this regiment. And then obviously you'd have to add on the extra men from repair and maintenance. So that's just a general estimate of how many men are within both of these regiments. It's hard to tell, but when you add in the fact that there are airborne units for the VDV, and you could click on each one over here, 31st Guards Assault Brigade, over here 83rd Guards Assault Brigade. So there's a good 3 divisions that are located around this area, around the southern Bakhmut sector. And in terms of their specific manpower, that is very hard to estimate. But in terms of an air assault brigade, I've seen numbers ranging around the 2,000 mark. Of course, most of them are not fighting on the front lines, as I described before. Most of them are on the rear. But generally, their location is in this area. So that's the closest we'll get to troop breakdown. So you can look at my map. You can see how many are around the front line. There's about 3 in the southern Bakhmut sector, and then another 2 in Bakhmut itself and to the north. And I'm going to be adding more units if I could find out the information about their location. And then you have the LPR unit, Prizhak Brigade, probably smaller in size. You have another air assault regiment. Air assault regiments obviously smaller, and they're part of a larger brigade of the VDV. So it's hard to tell again with those numbers. Another airborne regiment. You have Patriot PMC, and you have a bunch of other private military contractors that have come in to replace Wagner Group. I don't know how many are in each of them. Maybe a couple hundred, just as an estimate. These PMCs are much less powerful in terms of manpower than Wagner, but they do have very similar equipment, and they do have a lot of funding from Russian elites like Shoigu and from actually Gazprom. And so that's really the general idea of the Russian breakdown in this area. And so they have a lot of new units that are being moved in as reinforcements, some of them from the Liman direction, Kupiansk direction, different units that were actually elite units from the VDV airborne troops being moved to the southern flank of Bakhmut, which indicates that the Russians are taking this threat seriously and that they are worried about a potential Ukrainian breakthrough. But that also means that they're diverting attention from other parts of the front line they would have liked to focus on. They're also moving forces out of Kherson to defend in Bakhmut and Zaporozhye. And all of this comes at a time where we have received numerous reports that the Russians have amassed about 180,000 troops spanning from the Bakhmut direction. So let's map this out from the Bakhmut direction over here all the way up to the Liman and Kupiansk directions. So that would generally be in these areas marked in red, in these red lines. And so this 180,000 number, which I've seen circulated a lot on pro-Ukrainian side, this is not a new number. These are not new Russian troops. These Russian troops, most of them at least, have been on the front line for really many months. Obviously, many of them have been rotated, but generally it's comprised of the same men from the same units, just being rotated around. This is not like 180,000 new men were just sent to the front line out of nowhere in the past month or so. That's not what this means. It just means that when you look at the total amount of Russian forces in these general directions, you have about 180,000 troops. Now, a lot of them are in the rear, a lot of them are on the front lines as well, but a lot of those forces are from BAR's volunteer units, which are less experienced and less equipped, and also from Russian territorial defense forces, because there actually are Russian territorial defense units, surprisingly. I know that's mainly a Ukrainian thing, but there are also Russian equivalents, a lot of them, from Donetsk and Luhansk. I might actually be able to find some of them on the Kherson front, because a lot of the elite units in Kherson were replaced by territorial defense units. You could see that as I'm clicking, there was BAR's units, like I said before. Let me see if I could find a territorial defense one, though, because that would be interesting if I could find that in this area. If I can, then it doesn't matter. But anyway, in terms of the breakdown of the Russian forces in this area, in terms of their dispositions, you have about 50,000 in the Bakhmut sector, according to these reports. And I can believe that look in terms of like whether they're on the rear or not, that doesn't matter. Just the total amount in that general area, 50,000. That's the estimate for Bakhmut. And then another 120,000 for the area around Liman to Kupiansk. That could also make sense. And it would make sense that Russia would have more men around the Kupiansk sector just because it's closer to Russia itself. So you need it in order to maintain defense within the Russian borders. That's why you want to have more forces over there. It's also closer to the borders, so it's just easier to ship men to there and connect them to the rear. So that's really it in terms of the troop concentrations. Let's go back to the situation around Klishchiivka and look at the Russian counterattack. So the Russians, as we said before, they successfully defended against the Ukrainian assaults. Not the initial assaults taking over the open fields, but the Ukrainian assaults that were aimed at entering the town itself. They were able to defend against those ones from the north, especially, but also from the western direction. And so since then, the Russians have been able to conduct limited counterattacks. And let's look at the distance, actually. So they were able to take back this trench area, which the Ukrainians never controlled, but it was a gray zone for a certain period of time. Now the Russians are back over there in their fortified forward positions. So, they advanced maybe 0.5 miles in that area in the north and were able to secure the high ground in that area. Then to the west, they were able to advance about 0.85 miles and retake some of the key tree lines that were to the west of Klishchiivka, like over here, and also some of the open fields that are in between the canal and Klishchiivka. And so this general area, this general square that I'm marking is what they were able to retake, which does give them a bit of a breather and prevents Ukraine from directly assaulting Klishchiivka, but it does not mean that Klishchiivka is now totally safe. The Russians will have to continue sending manpower to this area to defend against constant Ukrainian assaults to prevent a total breakthrough. But still, the Ukrainians are moving more men in this direction. They're feeling emboldened. They're more so on the attack mode right now, although the Russians are trying to conduct, this sort of active defense by conducting counterattacks. Their goal is not to conduct their offensive of their own in the sector. That's more so the Ukrainian plan. And so we're going to see how that develops. So thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.